Welcome to another explainer. Today we're unpacking what's often called the grand experiment of the state economy. This isn't just about tweaking a few market rules. It's an economic framework that literally attempts to engineer human society right from the top down. If you've ever wondered what actually happens when a government tries to manage every single moving part of a nation's wealth, well, you're absolutely in the right place. We're going to explore the history, the mechanics, and honestly, the monumental real-world impacts of this highly debated system. Okay, let's dive into a little thought experiment drawn right from our source text. Imagine waking up tomorrow in a country where a central authority dictates, well, everything. They decide your job, they set your wages, and they even determine exactly what products you're allowed to buy at the store. Crazy, right? It immediately forces us to ask, would such a deeply controlled system finally eliminate poverty and create ultimate equality? Or would it inherently destroy human freedom, innovation, and that natural competitive drive? It's a massive question, and to answer it, we really need to look at how this system actually works from the ground up.
So let's jump right into Section 1, the birth of state economy.
To understand why anyone would want to build such a tightly controlled, honestly, kind of rigid system, we first need to look at its foundation, a state economy, which, by the way, is also widely known as a command economy or centrally planned economy, completely replaces the natural market forces of supply and demand with direct, absolute government control. Instead of private business owners deciding what to put on supermarket shelves based on what we, the consumers, want to buy, the state acts as the central brain. The state decides what gets produced, how it gets produced, and exactly who gets to consume it. But this idea didn't just appear out of nowhere in a vacuum. It was actually a desperate reaction to the extreme capitalism and worker exploitation going on during the Industrial Revolution, a time where factory owners hoarded wealth while workers really suffered. This massive inequality inspired Karl Marx, who introduced the theory of class struggle. Then Friedrich Engels helped develop those thoughts into concrete socialist economic theories. And finally, Vladimir Lenin took these theories off the page and thrust them into a massive real-world implementation right after the Russian Revolution. In a historical blink of an eye, the entire paradigm of ownership shifted completely. Moving on to Section 2, how central planning works. So, what is the actual day-to-day machinery required to run a whole nation's economy from a single desk? Well, the core principle is deliberately eliminating private profit to prioritize the welfare and equality of the collective public. In this setup, the government outright owns the major strategic industries. Think things like railways, steel, energy, and telecommunications. Everything is geared toward national priorities rather than individual wealth building. By regulating prices and controlling resources, the central planners aim to guarantee basic needs. The goal is making sure no one is left behind, even if it means capping how much anyone can get ahead. The central planning functions almost like an intricate set of mechanical gears. It forces a raw economic concept entirely through a government pipeline. Gear 1 is planning. Authorities set a massive target like, okay, we need to build 100,000 houses this year. Gear 2 allocates the massive amounts of steel and concrete required. Gear 3 is the actual production by state-owned construction firms. Gear 4 dictates exactly who gets to live in those houses. And finally, Gear 5 monitors the success of the whole operation. Every single step is actively managed by the state. Imagine the staggering math required to calculate materials for an entire country without a free market to guide prices. It's like a giant puzzle.
All right, let's get into Section 3, real-world historical experiments.
Because theory on paper is one thing, right? But let's look at what actually happened when these massive concepts were put to the test across millions of citizens. The Soviet Union stands as the most famous large-scale example of a centrally planned economy. And impartially speaking, the achievements were undeniably staggering. They forced rapid industrialization, launched the very first satellite into space, and built massive military strength in record time. However, the trade-offs were severe. The system ultimately struggled under immense bureaucratic weight. You had a nation that could literally put rockets in orbit, but suffered chronic shortages of basic everyday consumer goods like bread and shoes because everything was planned years in advance. And without market competition, innovation eventually just stagnated. It is truly fascinating to see how this grand experiment fractured over time. Today, a country like North Korea continues to operate as a nearly pure state economy, retaining extreme centralized control but remaining largely isolated from the world. Meanwhile, other nations that started with early, strict central planning, most notably China, eventually realized they had to pivot. They adopted major market reforms, carefully injecting capitalist strategies into their state frameworks just to survive and compete on the global stage. Which brings us to Section 4, the pros and cons. Now, every massive human experiment has deep trade-offs. To truly grasp the state economy, we need to weigh the intended benefits directly against the systemic failures. You can clearly see the fundamental tension of this economic model here. On one hand, you have immense security, heavily reduced wealth inequality, guaranteed access to healthcare and education, highly stable prices, and the potential for full employment, simply because the state just creates the jobs. But on the flip side is the heavy cost. We're talking a severe lack of innovation because there's no profit incentive, incredibly slow bureaucracy, practically no choice for consumers at the store, and a huge risk of resource misallocation. I mean, if the central planners make a math error, the whole system feels it. These trade-offs highlight the fundamental clash between two extreme ends of the economic spectrum. On one side, the state economy, where the government decides everything, intensely focused on equality through central planning with basically zero competition. On the exact opposite side is the market economy, where the free market decides, driven purely by the pursuit of profit, guided by the organic forces of supply and demand, and fueled by fierce, high-stakes competition. They are fundamentally opposite approaches to organizing human labor and resources.
And that leads us to our final part, Section 5. The rise of mixed economies.
History shows us that absolute extremes rarely last forever in a changing world. Eventually, nations operating pure state economies realized they simply couldn't ignore the immense outside pressures of the modern globe. Rapid globalization meant countries had to interact and trade. The relentless demand for technological competition and innovation meant that slow, centrally planned bureaucracies were falling behind. Combine that with broad efficiency concerns and a growing consumer population demanding actual variety in their goods, and, well, it forced a widespread, historic shift away from pure, absolute state control. So, the ultimate takeaway from our sources is this modern synthesis. Today, the vast majority of successful modern nations operate as mixed economies. Basically, they capture the best of both worlds. They allow the free market to drive innovation, profit, and competition, but they retain government oversight to manage social welfare, build infrastructure, and prevent monopolies. A perfect example from our text is India. They maintained heavy state control right after independence, but eventually initiated massive economic liberalization and market reforms in 1991 to become the mixed economy it is today. To wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with a final, provocative question drawn directly from the core tension of our sources. If you absolutely had to choose between the two extremes we've discussed today, would you choose a state economy that guarantees absolute equality and basic needs, or a market economy that offers unlimited freedom, choice, and competition, but risks leaving some people behind? Take a moment to really think about what matters most to you, and let us know your answer and your reasoning in the comments below.